Today we will be discussing about the sensory processes as part of the basic psychological processes. We know that we will be getting constant sensory information through 5 sensory modalities through eyes, ears, nose, tongue and the skin. These sensations are vision, hearing, smell, taste, touch. On top of this, there will be some special sensations as well. They are within the skin, we know the movement of the body, the position of the body, which is known as kinesthetic and proprioception, and additionally we also have another sense that is known as vestibular sense, which is responsible for our balance. But what we need to know is that despite the sensation or the sensory stimulus being the same, the experience is different in each individual. Therefore, we need to know what causes sensation, what are the factors of the sensory stimulus, and as well as the individual factors. Through this lecture, we will be discussing about the process of sensation, sensation and perception, and the qualities and related aspects. Let us start with a basic question: what is sensation? Sensation is an awareness that some sort of sensory experience is being done. It is the most fundamental and the simple mental activity, because without sensation there are no other cognitive functions. Each sensory organ will have some specialized sensory cells known as sensory receptors, which receive the physical energy coming from the sensory stimulus, and they transform that into neural energy known as transduction, a process. There are 3 types of specialized sensory receptors. They are exteroceptor, interoceptors and proprioceptors. Exteroceptors, as the name suggests, that they are associated with reception of the sensory information from the external agents, and interoceptors, they are primarily concerned with the organs located in the viscera such as lungs, heart, kidneys, etc. But between the exteroceptors and the interoceptors, we are consciously aware of the information and the experiences that are produced by the external sensory organs, whereas the information communicated by the interoceptors is not available to our consciousness. And the third one is proprioceptors. These specialized receptors are located at the tendons or the muscle joints as well as the bone joints. By this introductory view of this concept, you would be able to appreciate that sensation is a conscious experience, and this is one of the most fundamental cognitive activity. Then the next question that comes is, how do we detect a stimulus? This is studied as part of signal detection. The signal detection depends on certain qualities of sensory stimulus, such as the quality, the intensity, vividness, longevity, plus coupled with the individual's characteristics. By these examples, we would be able to appreciate that there is a relationship between the physical activity, that is sensory stimulation, and our perception, that is a cognitive or psychological activity. The next few issues that we would be interested in: when the stimulus being the same, why some people detect it, some people will not be able to detect it. This relationship is studied under as part of psychophysics, that is, there is a relationship which exists between physical stimulus and the intensity of the physical energy and the perception of the psychological phenomenon. And primarily we will be concerned at number 1, what is the minimum intensity of the stimulus that is necessary to produce a conscious experience. Number 2, from one amount of sensory stimulus, what is the minimum change that is required to produce a change in experience from as compared to the previous level. And the last one is the ability to detect the sensory stimulus as sensory stimuli. For these 3 questions, we get answer from psychophysics. Psychologists have studied as part of Gestalt theories the relationship between the physical energy and the psychological energy. The first one is known as absolute threshold or absolute Lyman, wherein the word Lyman means threshold. Here under this, say for example, we are taking a cup of tea and there is no sugar, and we go on adding sugar granule by granule. In the first few granules, we will not be able to experience that it is sweet. As we go on increasing granule by granule, there comes a point where we think it is sweet. This minimum intensity of the stimulus that is required to produce a conscious experience that there is a sensory experience is known as absolute threshold. Technically, to put it, any sensory stimulus, the minimum quantity of it is properly detected. So, by 50% of the times is known as absolute threshold or absolute limit. Now, let us consider the second example. We understood that, to continue with the same example of having a cup of tea, we understood that the tea has become sweet. Now, we have to add some more to understand whether it has become sweeter. What amount of sugar is necessary to understand the tea has become sweeter than what it was before? Particularly, in effect, this phenomena is studied under the next lemon, that is just noticeable differences. The just noticeable difference is the smallest value that produces a conscious experience that the sensory intensity is changing. For example, for some people, maybe adding half a spoon of sugar may indicate that the sweetness has increased, but whereas for some people lesser or more quantities are required. So, this minimum change in the intensity from one level to another level that is required to produce a conscious experience is known as just noticeable difference. The next question which we asked in the very beginning is, how do we detect a stimulus? This has got far reaching implication. For example, we want to decide whether the stimulus that we have received is real or not. These psychophysicists regard as 2 conditions. One is the stimulus that is relevant to us is technically denoted as signal. Any stimulus that is not relevant to us is known as noise. For example, what is required from us is that we need to differentiate between which is a stimulus, which is a noise. It presents 2 conditions for us. For example, there is a signal and we have to detect whether it is present or not present, condition number 1. In condition 2, the signal was not there or noise was there, we have to identify that it was not a signal or it was noise. When a signal is present and we identify this as a signal, it is known as a hit, and when the signal is present and we do not detect it, it is known as a miss. Similarly, in condition 2, there are 2 probabilities. Number 1, there was no signal, but still the person identifies this as a signal, which is known as false alarm. And condition 2, there was no signal and the person rejects it that there was no signal. This is correct rejection. What are the implications of this? For example, when say in aviation or in army settings, where a personnel responsible for detecting certain signals on the radar misses a signal, then the consequences would be very catastrophic. On the other hand, when there was no signal and the person identifies this as a signal, then the results would be unnecessary, that the preparation that it would call for would be irrelevant to us. So, when we look at the pattern of the responses in both the conditions, we arrive at two conclusions. One is how strong is the stimulus for the person to detect, that is signal detection. Number two, what is the tendency of this person to report either continuously yes or continuously no. In other words, what is the probability that the subject would detect a signal or the stimulus as even if it is not existing, that there is a probability of saying yes or the probability of saying no. The implications are many more in several fields. For example, the doctor might apply this knowledge in detecting whether a set of symptoms qualify for a diagnosis, number one, or this set of symptoms are false alarm or false signals. And similarly, in statistics, we want to know whether the effect of intervention is really effective or not effective. This depends on our judgments of the signal that we have got. In signal detection, the third example that I would like to illustrate is medical diagnosis. For example, a radiologist looks at a radio image and detects a white patch in the image. There are two conditions. He might think that it is a tumor or he might think it is not a tumor. When it was a tumor and the doctor misses it, the implication is that the patient will suffer. When it was not a tumor and the doctor detects this as a tumor, the other condition which is a false alarm, it would unnecessarily call for intervention. So, by these examples we can understand signal detection theory has wide reaching application wherever we have to make judgment depending on the sensory information that we receive. From now on, we look at how vision, hearing, smell, taste and touch sensation are experienced by us the human beings. To begin with, since vision is responsible for more than 80% of our conscious experience, I would like to begin with the visual sensory experience. Before we understand vision, we may need to little bit understand about the structure and the function of eye in a very generalized fashion at least. The structure of eye has three layers: sclera, which is the outermost layer, which is white. It also has in the front, in the middle, cornea. Except for this part, the sclera is opaque. And second innermost layer is choroid, which contains iris and it also contains blood vessels necessary for oxygen supply to the eye. The third layer, the most interior layer is retina. The retina consists of the specialized sensory receptors known as rods and cones. We can compare the human eye with a camera. The lens and the cornea in the human eye are equivalent to the lens in the camera, and the retina is equivalent to the photoplate in the camera. What happens in the vision? Let us see. Suppose the light enters through the pupil, that is the opening in the iris, and to accommodate the light, the lens is pulled by certain muscles, so that the lens changes its shape either thicker or thinner depending on the stimulus, and the light is bent inwards, and so that the light exactly falls on retina, a place called fovea, where the concentration of the cones are at its maximum in retina. From this, we can understand how much light is allowed inside depends on the iris, which is very quick to act depending on the light condition, but in contrast the retina acts little slowly. I have mentioned already that retina contains two specialized photoreceptors known as cones and rods. Both of them have distinctive functions. The cones are said to be functioning under bright light conditions, whereas rods are responsible for our vision during darker, dull or night vision. Since fovea has got the highest concentration of the cones, it is also responsible for the maximum acuity of vision. Then the posterior most part of the eye through which the optic nerve exists, there will not be any kind of photoreceptors. Despite having a gap here, we never see gaps in our vision. That means the brain fills up the sensory information by itself and we see a clear vision or the clear visual field. Based on this example, we would be able to appreciate that vision, what begins as purely physical sensory activity, is ultimately a cognitive activity. Now, let us look at various theories of vision. There are three theories of vision which are widely accepted. Number one, duplicity theory given by Wantis and Squeeze. According to him, there are two photoreceptors, that is rods and cones. Each one is responsible for a different kind of sensation. As many times we have discussed, rods are responsible for achromatic sensation and cones are responsible for chromatic sensation. That is, A means lack of, chroma means color. That is, achromatic means colorless vision, chromatic vision means colored vision. And rods are responsible for adaptation in darker situation and cones are responsible for adaptation in lighter situation. But this theory has certain limitation, in that it cannot explain why or how we experience so many colors, number one. Number two, even when a particular color stimulus is taken away from our visual field, for quite some time we experience either the same color or some other color that is complementary to that. These limitations are explained by subsequent theories. One prominent theory is given by Young and Helmholtz. According to them, there are three elementary colors, that are red, yellowish green and blue. The photoreceptors are there for each of these three primary colors. Any wavelength or any photic energy that activates these receptors can also give us a color perception, and different wavelengths are responsible for different kinds of color perception. We know from basic knowledge of physics that color could be understood based on the wavelength of each color. So, that means each of these receptors are capable of giving or producing a particular color sensation depending on the wavelength. That means, if the light in its different wavelengths activates in a particular way, we experience a particular chromatic sensation. What happens when all the cones are activated or the wavelength is equal? Then we experience a color of white, and when there is no wavelength, then we experience a color of black. But at the same time, even this theory does not explain to us why then we perceive color when there is no actual sensory stimulus in the environment. This answer is partly provided by Herring's theory. Herring's theory says that there are 6 elementary colors, and these 6 could be divided into groups of 2, which works in a complementary way. They are red green, blue, yellow, black and white. According to this theory, the receptors act or perform in switch on off mode. That means, in a complementary group, one receptor acts, the other receptor shuts off. For example, we have just learnt that red and green is a complementary pair. When a particular wavelength of denoting red color activates the cones, automatically the receptor responsible for green is shut off. And similarly, when a particular wavelength that activates green color shuts off red color. What happens when the conscious sensory experience is over? That, for example, we see a red object and this red object is taken away. After some time, still our photic receptors are active. As a result, we continue to see red color despite that there was no red object in the environment. This is known as positive after effect. But sometimes when the red object is taken away, we also perceive the green color. This is known as negative after effect. The reason being, once one particular receptor exhausts its chromatic material, automatically the complementary receptor takes over and start showing its function. Now, we will understand about hearing. Again, before we understand hearing, let us look at the basic anatomy of ear. Ear could be divided into three major divisions, that is external ear, middle ear and the inner ear. The external ear indicates the ear that is seen outside, which is technically called pinna and the ear canal, and the middle ear is inclusive of the tympanic membrane, and there are three small bones attached to this tympanic membrane in the ear. They are Malays, Incus and Stapes, which are the smallest bones in our body. These bones are further attached to oval window and cochlea, which is a snail shaped one, that is the reason the name is cochlea, and vestibular, cochlear and tympanic canals are part of this cochlea. There is also a basilar membrane which divides the cochlear and tympanic canals. What happens when we hear or how we receive sound? The sound is collected by the outer ear, that is the pinna and the air filled auditory canal. Then the sound is amplified by the tympanic membrane, oscillation of the bones, and it reaches the innermost ear cochlea, wherein it is further amplified and it is transducted into neural energy. Thus, we can understand that outer, middle and inner ear are responsible for collection of the sound, amplification of the sound and further amplification as well as transduction of the sound respectively. There are three basic theories of hearing. Number one is the place or resonance theory. This theory was proposed by von Helmholtz in 1863. He says that the cilia that are present in the basilar membrane, we already noted what basilar membrane, that is the membrane in the cochlea which differentiate between the cochlear and the tympanic canal. What happens when we hear a sound? The ciliary muscles that are present in the basilar membrane are akin to the keys in the piano. When we hear any sound, each piano key is attuned to particular frequency. For example, if there is 10 hertz, one particular key is responsible and another frequency, another key is responsible for this. Similarly, depending on the frequency of the sound, the cilia present in the basilar membrane start acting differentially. As a result, we perceive different frequencies of the sound. The next one is the frequency theory by Rutherford. He says our auditory energies are directly correlated with the neural energy. That means, if there are 100 frequency sounds invading, activating our ear, there will be 100 impulses at the neuronal level. But this theory has got some limitation. The maximum the neurons can fire are 1000 impulses per second, but whereas the human ear can detect more than near about 10,000 frequencies. So, this theory may be relevant when it comes to explanation of the frequencies that are below 1000 frequencies, but it cannot explain when the sound has frequencies above 1000. This limitation is very classically explained by another theory known as Volley Theory, proposed by Weber and Bray. According to them, that nerve fibers fire in a squad-like fashion. For example, if there is a 500 frequency of sound wave, separately each nerve, that is specifically maybe it might fire in a group of 50s or 100s, which put together our brain perceives that it was of high frequency. Now, let us look at three other sensory experiences. One is olfaction. In olfaction, the layer in the uppermost part of our nose has specialized sensory receptors which detect the chemical molecules present in the air, and this information is transported through the brain through olfactory bulb and olfactory nerve. The basic smells are fragrant, acid, burnt and caprylic. The next one is gustatory. We know that the taste smell comes from the tongue. To detect the taste, the substance has to be in a liquid form. You might have noticed on our tongue there will be several bumpy areas called papillae. These papillae are very rich in taste bud, which are the specialized receptors responsible for taste. The basic taste that we can detect are salty, sour, sweet and bitter. The information from the taste buds go to parietal lobe in the brain, wherein the taste is detected or understood. The last one, cutaneous, means skin. So, cutaneous sensation means the sensation that we receive through skin, and it includes both tactile sensation as well as proprioception. Tactile sensation means basically the sensation that we get through touch. This includes pressure, cold, hot, touch, again light touch or pressured touch. And there are certain specialized receptors located at tendons, joints and within the muscles, which gives us the information that how our body is aligned. For example, while sitting or standing, without looking at ourselves, we can understand what is the position of our limbs in relation to our body. For example, while you are standing, you can detect in case if your hands are next to your body without looking at them. Similarly, if you are sitting in a chair, you can understand whether your hands are stretched forward, whether legs are stretched forward or crossed without looking at them. This information reaches our brain through proprioceptors, which gives us this information about the position of the body in relation to the space or in relation to self. The next one is kinesthetic. Similarly, whether the body is moving or is it in motion also is detected by kinesthetic receptors. So, what we commonly call as cutaneous sensation, it is not just restricted to the touch sensation, but it also includes proprioception and kinesthetic sensation in addition to tactile sensation.